The fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across Bradford Hayes' face as he held his 6-year-old daughter against his chest. His phone pressed tight to his ear. His voice cracked. "I'll get the money. Whatever it takes. I'll get it." Ruby's small hand clutched his shirt, her breathing shallow, uneven. He didn't notice the woman in the tailored black coat standing near the entrance, watching him with an intensity that had nothing to do with sympathy. Vivian Sterling had been searching for the perfect candidate for 2 weeks, someone desperate enough to sign, presentable enough to convince, and principled enough not to ask questions. But as she observed this man singing softly to his daughter, his calloused hands gentle despite their obvious strength, she realized she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. 3 months, $500,000, a contract marriage to secure her inheritance. It should have been simple. It should have stayed professional. But when you pay someone to pretend to love you, what happens when the pretending stops? And neither of you knows when that moment came. Bradford had been an architect once, the kind who sketched buildings in coffee-stained notebooks and talked about form, following function with the enthusiasm of someone who believed work could be art. That life ended 2 years ago on a Tuesday morning when his wife hemorrhaged during childbirth, leaving him with a daughter who had her mother's eyes and a heart that struggled to beat properly. He'd traded blueprints for a steering wheel, driving for a ride-share service at night, while taking freelance design projects during Ruby's school hours. The apartment they lived in was small, tucked into a neighborhood where sirens were as common as birdsong, but he kept it clean and filled it with Ruby's drawings taped to every wall. Tonight, those walls felt like they were closing in. The doctor's words from earlier still echoed in his skull. Congenital heart defect. Surgery required. Soon. The number she'd mentioned, $150,000 after insurance, might as well have been $1 million. Bradford had $17,000 in savings. He'd already sold everything of value except his drafting table and his wedding ring, which he couldn't bring himself to part with, even though Caroline would have told him not to be sentimental. Ruby stirred in his arms, her small voice asking if they could go home now, and he pressed his lips to her forehead, humming the lullaby Caroline used to sing. He didn't see Vivian approach until her shadow fell across them both. She was striking in the way expensive things always were, all sharp angles and perfect posture. Her dark hair pulled back so severely it looked painful. Her coat probably cost more than his rent. When she spoke, her voice was crisp, businesslike, as if they were in a boardroom instead of a hospital corridor. "I'd like to speak with you," she said, and held out a business card that was heavier than it should have been. Bradford stared at it. Vivian Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, Sterling Industries. He'd heard of the company. Who hadn't? They owned half the commercial real estate in the city. "About what?" he asked, and she glanced at Ruby. Then back at him, with something in her eyes that might have been calculation or might have been loneliness. He couldn't tell. "About a proposition that could benefit us both," she said. They met 3 days later at a cafe that served $20 lattes and had furniture too modern to be comfortable. Vivian was already seated when Bradford arrived, her laptop open, a stack of papers beside her untouched cup. She got straight to the point. Her grandmother's will stipulated that she must be married before her 35th birthday to inherit control of the company. She had 3 months. She'd already exhausted conventional options, dating apps, matchmakers, even a brief consideration of rekindling things with an ex who'd proven to be more interested in her portfolio than her person. "I need someone who won't fall in love with me," she said flatly, as if this were a perfectly reasonable requirement. "Someone who has a compelling reason to walk away at the end." Bradford should have left. Should have told her this was insane, that people didn't do things like this outside of bad movies. Instead, he thought about Ruby's medication bottles lining their bathroom counter, about the way she'd stopped running at recess because it made her chest hurt, about the pediatric cardiologist who'd said they couldn't wait much longer. Vivian slid a contract across the table. $500,000. 3 months of cohabitation. Public appearances as needed. A clean divorce afterward. No strings, no complications. She'd already had her lawyers draft everything. "Why me?" he asked, and she met his gaze without flinching. "Because you need the money desperately enough to sign, but you're a good father, desperately enough not to be tempted to stay for the wrong reasons. You'll leave when it's done. That's what I need." He read the contract 3 times. It was thorough, clinical, covering everything from separate bedrooms to social media protocols to what happened if either party violated the terms. There was a clause about Ruby. She could live with them. Vivian would cover medical expenses immediately upon signing, and Bradford would have full custody with no interference. It was more generous than it needed to be. He thought about his daughter at home with Mrs. Chen from down the hall, probably watching cartoons, unaware that her father was sitting in a cafe, contemplating something that felt like selling his soul. But souls were abstract. Ruby's heartbeat wasn't. He signed on the last page, and Vivian countersigned with a fountain pen that made a scratching sound against the paper. "We start tomorrow," she said. "Pack light. My attorney will handle the marriage license. We'll do the ceremony at City Hall." The wedding took 7 minutes. A clerk with a bored expression rattled through the vows, while Bradford held Ruby's hand, and Vivian stood beside him in a gray suit that probably cost more than his car. She didn't wear white. He didn't wear his wedding ring. He'd finally sold it to cover that month's rent. When the clerk said he could kiss the bride, Vivian offered her cheek, and Bradford's lips barely brushed her skin before she stepped back. Ruby asked if this meant Vivian was her new mommy, and neither adult knew how to answer. They signed papers in triplicate. Vivian's attorney, a silver-haired man named Robert, who looked like he'd never smiled in his life, witnessed everything with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Bradford wondered how many contract marriages this man had facilitated. Vivian's phone buzzed constantly throughout, and she answered it twice, stepping into the hallway to have conversations in a low voice that sounded like corporate strategy. When they emerged into the afternoon sunlight, Bradford had a ring on his finger that Vivian had purchased that morning. Titanium, practical, nothing like the gold band Caroline had given him, and the strangest feeling that he'd just crossed a bridge that was burning behind him. Vivian's house was not a house, it was an estate, sprawling across 2 acres in a neighborhood where the lawns looked like golf courses and the gates had security codes. Ruby pressed her face against the car window, eyes wide, and whispered that it looked like a castle. Inside, it was all white walls and abstract art and furniture that seemed designed to be admired rather than used. A housekeeper named Margaret showed Bradford and Ruby to their rooms, 2 bedrooms connected by a bathroom, far from the master suite where Vivian presumably slept when she wasn't working. The rooms were immaculate, impersonal, like high-end hotel suites. Ruby's room had been prepared with new furniture, but it felt sterile. There were no toys, no color, nothing a child would actually want. Bradford unpacked their suitcases, hanging Ruby's drawings on the walls with tape, arranging her stuffed animals on the bed. When he turned around, Vivian was standing in the doorway, watching. "She can redecorate," Vivian said, her voice carefully neutral. "Whatever she wants. Margaret can take her shopping." Bradford shook his head. "She doesn't need things bought. She needs things made." Vivian's brow furrowed slightly, as if he'd spoken a language she didn't understand. Later that night, after Ruby was asleep, Bradford found Vivian in her home office, a room lined with law books and architectural photography. She was still in her suit, still working, her face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple monitors. He knocked on the doorframe. She looked up, and for just a moment, he saw something in her expression that might have been exhaustion, or might have been something deeper. Ground rules, she said before he could speak. I work late. Don't wait up. Breakfast is at 7 if you want it, but I'm usually gone by 6:30. Margaret handles groceries and cleaning. You're free to use the kitchen, the gym, the library. Stay out of my office unless invited. Bradford nodded. He understood boundaries. My ground rule, he said. Ruby comes first, always. If she needs something, if she's scared, if she wants to talk to me, nothing you're doing is more important than that. Not your company, not your inheritance. Nothing. Vivian's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but she nodded. Agreed. They stood there in the doorway, two strangers who were legally married, and Bradford felt the weight of the next 3 months settling over him like a physical thing. Vivian turned back to her screens. The attorney will call you tomorrow. He'll need to verify our living situation for the inheritance committee. Be convincing. She didn't say goodnight. He left her there, drowning in blue light, and thought about how much sadness a person could hide behind efficiency. The first week was strange in the way that living in a museum would be strange. Beautiful, cold, utterly disconnected from real life. Vivian left before dawn and returned after Ruby's bedtime. When they did cross paths, their interactions were brief, polite, devoid of anything resembling warmth. Bradford cooked meals that Vivian never ate. He worked on freelance projects at the kitchen island, while Ruby did homework beside him. The house was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. Margaret tried to be friendly. But she'd worked for Vivian for 8 years and had clearly been instructed not to ask questions. Bradford learned the rhythm of the house, how Vivian took her coffee black, how she always showered at exactly 5:15 in the morning, how she came home with her shoulders tight and her jaw clenched and disappeared into her office without acknowledging anyone. Ruby tried. God, she tried so hard to connect with this woman who was technically her stepmother now. She'd draw pictures and leave them on Vivian's desk. She'd ask Vivian questions at breakfast on the rare mornings they overlapped. What's your favorite color? Do you like pancakes? Have you ever been to Disneyland? Vivian would answer in single words, not unkindly, but with the affect of someone completing a survey. Blue. No. Once. Bradford watched his daughter's face fall a little more each time, and something in his chest ached. On the 8th day, he found Ruby crying in her room, clutching the drawing she'd made, a picture of 3 people holding hands. She doesn't like me, Ruby sobbed, and Bradford held her and told her that wasn't true, that Vivian just didn't know how to show feelings, that some people were like that. He didn't know if he believed it himself. That night, Bradford broke his own rule and knocked on Vivian's office door after midnight. She was still working. All was working. She's 6 years old, he said without preamble. She's trying to make you like her, because that's what kids do. They want to be loved. You don't have to love her back, but you could at least pretend to care. That's what you're paying me for, right? Pretending? Vivian's face remained impassive, but her hand stopped moving on the mouse. I'm not good with children, she said. Bradford laughed, a bitter sound. Nobody's good with children. You just do it anyway because the alternative is breaking their hearts. Vivian stood abruptly, and for a moment he thought she might throw him out, end the contract, send them back to their small apartment and their unpaid bills. Instead, she walked past him toward Ruby's room. He followed. Vivian stood in the doorway of Ruby's bedroom, watching the little girl sleep. Ruby had kicked off her blankets and was curled around the stuffed elephant Bradford had bought her at a thrift store 3 years ago. The walls were covered now with her drawings, flowers and houses and stick figure families. Vivian stared at one drawing in particular. 3 people holding hands in front of a big house. She'd labeled them in crayon. Daddy. Me. Vivi. She calls me Vivi, Vivian said. So quietly Bradford almost didn't hear it. He stepped beside her, careful to maintain distance. Kids do that. Make nicknames. Make you into family whether you want to be or not. Vivian's throat worked as she swallowed. My parents didn't want me, she said suddenly, the words coming out flat, factual. They wanted an heir to the company, someone to mold. I learned very young that love was transactional. You performed correctly, you received approval. You failed, you received disappointment. Ruby doesn't perform. She just is. Bradford felt something shift, a wall cracking. That's because she's 6, and because I've never made her earn my love. Vivian turned to look at him, and in the dim light from the hallway, her face looked younger, more vulnerable. I don't know how to be what she wants, she admitted. Bradford shrugged. Start small. Read her a story tomorrow night. Ask her about her day. Show up. He left Vivian standing there and went to his own room, where he lay awake, wondering what kind of childhood produced a woman who thought love was something you bought or earned, but never simply received. The next morning, Bradford woke to find Vivian still in the house at 7:30, an unprecedented event. She was in the kitchen, standing awkwardly near the coffee maker when Ruby came downstairs. Good morning, Vivian said, and it sounded rehearsed but sincere. Ruby stopped, surprised. Good morning, Vivi. Vivian hesitated, then pulled out a chair. Would you like to eat breakfast together? I have 30 minutes before I need to leave. Ruby's face lit up like Christmas morning. She scrambled into the chair, chattering about school and her friends and the butterfly she'd seen yesterday. Vivian listened, actually listened, asking questions that were stilted but genuine. When she had to leave, she paused by Ruby's chair and, after a moment's hesitation, patted the girl's shoulder. It was awkward, brief, but Ruby beamed. As Vivian headed for the door, she glanced back at Bradford, and something in her expression asked, "Did I do it right?" He nodded. Things changed in small increments after that. Vivian started coming home earlier, 8 instead of 10, then 7 instead of 8. She'd sit with Ruby for half an hour before bedtime, reading stories in a voice that grew less mechanical with each passing night. Bradford would watch from the hallway sometimes, this billionaire CEO stumbling through picture books about talking animals, clearly out of her depth, but trying. Ruby soaked up the attention like a plant discovering sunlight. She started showing Vivian her homework, her art projects, the smooth rock she'd found that looked like a heart. Vivian kept the rock on her desk. Bradford noticed. He also noticed how Vivian had started asking his opinion on things. What did he think of the new landscaping plan? Did Ruby need new clothes? Should they repaint the guest room? Small questions, domestic questions, the kind that married people asked each other. The first public event was a charity gala at a hotel downtown. Vivian's attorney had stressed the importance of appearances. The inheritance committee would have representatives there, watching, evaluating. Bradford wore a rented tux that fit surprisingly well. Vivian emerged from her room in a black gown that transformed her from corporate ice queen to something approaching devastating. Ruby stayed home with Margaret, making Bradford promise to take pictures. In the car, Vivian briefed him on who would be there, which conversations mattered, how to deflect personal questions. We met through a mutual friend, she recited. It was unexpected but right. We married quickly because when you know, you know. The words sounded like a script. Bradford wondered if that's all relationships were to her, lines to be memorized and delivered. The gala was exactly as awful as Bradford expected. A room full of people wearing their net worth on their bodies, making conversation that was more performance than connection. Vivian's hand rested in the crook of his elbow as they circulated, and he noticed how her smile never reached her eyes, how her laugh at someone's joke was perfectly timed, but hollow. She introduced him as my husband, with the same inflection she might use for "my attorney" or "my accountant." But she stayed close, and Bradford found himself playing the role, his hand on the small of her back when they moved through the crowd, the way he'd lean in when she spoke as if they shared secrets, how he'd murmur comments about the guests that made her almost smile. It felt like choreography. It felt like lying. It felt, occasionally, like something else entirely. Halfway through the evening, an older woman with diamonds at her throat cornered them. She was on the inheritance committee. Vivian had warned him earlier. "So this is the mysterious husband," the woman said, her eyes sharp, assessing. "Quite a whirlwind romance, I hear. Tell me, Bradford, what is it about Vivian that captured your heart?" The question was a trap, obviously designed to catch them in a lie. Bradford looked at Vivian, at the rigid set of her shoulders, the brittle perfection of her composure, and found himself telling something closer to the truth than the rehearsed story. "She tries," he said quietly, "harder than anyone realizes. She's not good at showing what she feels, but she feels more than people give her credit for. And she showed up when I needed someone. That matters more than romance." Vivian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his arm. The older woman's eyes narrowed, searching for cracks in the facade, but apparently found none. She nodded and moved away. Vivian didn't speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was barely audible over the music. "You didn't have to say that." Bradford shrugged. "You wanted it to be convincing." They danced later because it was expected, Vivian's hand in his, her other hand resting on his shoulder, with the lightness of someone afraid to put down full weight. She smelled like something expensive and floral. "I'm not good at this," she said as they moved in slow circles. Bradford smiled despite himself. "You're better than you think. Ruby would tell you the same thing." Vivian looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something raw in her expression. "I've never had someone be patient with me while I figured out how to be human," she said. "My parents certainly weren't. Most people give up." "I'm not most people," Bradford said, "and you're paying me too much to give up after 2 weeks." He meant it as a joke, a way to lighten the moment, but Vivian flinched as if he'd struck her. She pulled back slightly, and the wall came back up, the mask reassembling itself. "Of course," she said, her voice cool again. "The contract. I'd almost forgotten." They finished the dance in silence, and Bradford realized he'd made a mistake, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. On the drive home, Vivian stared out the window, and Bradford wondered when the line between pretending and not pretending had started to blur, and whether he was the only one who'd noticed. Weeks 3 and 4 passed in a strange domesticity that felt more real than Bradford wanted to admit. Vivian started joining them for dinner, initially claiming she needed to maintain appearances in case Margaret reported back to anyone. But soon she was there most nights, without excuse. She was terrible at small talk, but got better at listening, nodding as Ruby recounted her day with the earnestness only 6-year-olds possessed. Bradford cooked. Simple things, pasta and roasted vegetables, and the occasional attempt at something more ambitious. And Vivian ate what he made without complaint. One night, she asked him to teach her how to make Ruby's favorite meal, macaroni and cheese from scratch. And Bradford stood beside her at the stove, guiding her hands as she whisked flour into butter. She burned the first batch. The second came out perfect. Ruby declared it the best thing she'd ever eaten, and Vivian smiled. Actually smiled. Not the corporate approximation, but something genuine. They fell into routines without discussing them. Bradford would make coffee at 6 and leave a cup on Vivian's desk. She'd leave him notes about groceries they needed or appointments to remember. Ruby started bringing her homework to Vivian's office, spreading out on the floor while Vivian worked, the silence companionable rather than cold. On weekends, they'd go to the park, the three of them, and Bradford would push Ruby on the swings while Vivian sat on a bench nearby, answering emails on her phone but present. Other families assumed they belonged together. The handsome father, the successful mother, the bright little girl. Sometimes Bradford forgot it wasn't real. Sometimes he'd catch Vivian watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between longing and fear, and he'd have to remind himself this was temporary, transactional, not transformation. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. Bradford had been reviewing the contract that morning. They were approaching the halfway mark when he found Vivian in the kitchen at lunch, which never happened. Her laptop was closed. She was just sitting there, staring at her untouched sandwich. "You okay?" he asked, and she looked up with eyes that were rimmed red. "My father called," she said. "He wanted to know if my arrangement was still on track." That's what he called it. An arrangement. Not a marriage, not a relationship. He asked if I'd managed to fool the committee yet. Bradford felt anger spike in his chest. "What did you tell him?" Vivian's laugh was hollow. "That yes, father, I'm fooling everyone perfectly. That's what I do, isn't it? Perform, execute, succeed." Her voice cracked on the last word. Bradford sat down across from her. "Is that what you think this is? A performance?" Vivian met his gaze, and the vulnerability in her expression made his breath catch. "Isn't it? We're playing house. You're playing my husband. I'm playing someone worthy of being loved. It's all pretend." Bradford shook his head slowly. "Ruby's not pretending. When she brings you her drawings, when she asks you to read to her, that's real. She loves you, Vivian. Not because you're paying us, but because you show up for her, because you try." Vivian's hands were shaking. "And what about you?" she asked, so quietly he almost didn't hear. "Are you pretending?" Bradford opened his mouth to say yes, to cite the contract, to maintain the boundary that was supposed to keep this simple. But the lie wouldn't come. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "I thought I was. But when I make coffee for you in the morning, when I listen for your car at night, when I watch you trying so hard to be good to Ruby even though it scares you, I don't think I'm pretending." Vivian stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "This wasn't supposed to happen. You were supposed to be practical. Mercenary. Someone who wanted the money and nothing else." Bradford stood too, crossing to stand behind her. "You want to know why I really signed that contract? Yes, I needed the money for Ruby. But I also thought maybe I could help you. This woman who was so clearly desperate that she'd marry a stranger to satisfy some legal requirement. You looked lonely, Vivian. Like you'd been alone your whole life and didn't know there was an alternative." She turned, and they were close, closer than they'd been since that stiff wedding kiss. "I am lonely," she whispered. "I've been lonely since I was Ruby's age, and realized my parents saw me as an investment, not a daughter. I built walls so high I forgot there was anything outside them. And then you came, and Ruby came, and suddenly there's light in this house, and noise and chaos, and I don't know what to do with any of it." Bradford's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "You don't have to do anything. You just have to let it in." Vivian's eyes searched his face. "What if I'm not brave enough?" He smiled softly. "You're the bravest person I know. You're just brave at the wrong things. You're brave at board meetings and hostile takeovers. Try being brave at this." She kissed him. Or he kissed her. Later, neither could agree on who moved first, but suddenly they were pressed together, and it wasn't choreographed or performed or calculated. It was messy and real and terrifying. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Vivian looked stricken. "This complicates things," she managed. Bradford laughed despite himself. "Vivian, things have been complicated since the moment Ruby called you Vivi, and you didn't correct her." She rested her forehead against his chest. I don't know how to do this. Any of this. I'm going to mess it up. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling her rigid posture gradually soften. Then we'll mess it up together. That's what couples do, right? They mess up and figure it out and keep going. The next 3 weeks were different. They stopped pretending to be strangers sharing a house and started acting like what they were becoming. A family, mismatched and imperfect, but real. Vivian cut back her hours at work, actually said no to meetings that ran past 7. She helped Ruby with homework, making mistakes and laughing about them instead of treating errors like failures. Bradford caught her singing while cooking dinner one night, off-key and unself-conscious. They held hands when they thought Ruby wasn't looking, stole kisses in the hallway, fell asleep on the couch together while watching movies. It felt like playing house, except it wasn't playing. The calendar pages turned, and the end of the 3-month contract loomed closer, but neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them wanted to. Ruby's surgery was scheduled for week 10. The doctors had been monitoring her heart, and Vivian had ensured she had the best pediatric cardiac team in the state. The night before the operation, Ruby was scared. She held both Bradford's and Vivian's hands, asking what-if questions that no parent wants to hear. What if I don't wake up? What if my heart stops? What if you're not there when I open my eyes? Vivian, who'd never been demonstrative, climbed into Ruby's bed and held the little girl against her chest. Listen, she said, placing Ruby's hand over her own heart. Feel that? That's what your heart is going to sound like when the doctors fix it. Strong and steady. And we'll both be there when you wake up. I promise. Ruby fell asleep between them, and Bradford looked at Vivian over his daughter's head, seeing everything he'd been afraid to name written on her face. The surgery took 6 hours. Bradford wore a path in the waiting room carpet, while Vivian sat rigid in a plastic chair, her hand clutching his whenever he passed. She'd canceled all her meetings for the week, something her assistant said she'd never done, not even for her grandmother's funeral. When the surgeon finally emerged to say the operation was a success, Vivian crumpled. Bradford caught her, held her while she shook with relief or fear or joy. He couldn't tell. Maybe all three. They stood in the hospital corridor. This arrangement that was supposed to be fake, and Bradford realized with startling clarity that he loved her. Not because she'd saved his daughter's life with her money, not because she'd given them a home, but because she'd let them save her from her own isolation. Ruby recovered quickly, the resilience of childhood manifesting in how she bounced back from major surgery. Within days, she was complaining about the hospital food and demanding that Vivian sneak in cookies. Within a week, she was asking when she could go home. Home. She meant Vivian's house. Bradford's heart ached at how naturally the word came to her, how completely she'd accepted this manufactured family as real. Vivian visited every day, sometimes twice, showing up in the middle of important meetings because Ruby had texted that she was bored. Bradford watched his contract wife read picture books to his daughter in a hospital bed and thought about how drastically wrong he'd been about what this arrangement would mean. They brought Ruby home on a Saturday. Vivian had redecorated her room while she was in the hospital, not with expensive designer things, but with personal touches. A mobile of paper cranes she'd folded herself hung above the bed. Photos of the three of them in frames on every surface. A new bookshelf stuffed with novels about brave girls and magical worlds. Ruby cried when she saw it, happy tears, and hugged Vivian so hard they both nearly fell over. I love you, Vivi, Ruby said, simple and certain the way children were. Vivian's face did something complicated, and then she said the words Bradford suspected she hadn't spoken to anyone in decades. I love you too, sweetheart. It wasn't smooth or easy. Her voice caught. But she said it, and meant it, and that was everything. That night, after Ruby was asleep, Bradford found Vivian on the back patio, staring at the sky. "One more week," he said, sitting beside her. "Then the contract's done. You'll get your inheritance. We'll have fulfilled our end." The words tasted like ash. Vivian nodded without looking at him. "I've been thinking about that." Bradford's heart sank. Of course she had. She was nothing if not thorough, already planning the exit strategy, the clean divorce, how to disentangle their lives with minimal disruption. "I know Ruby will want to stay in touch," she continued, "and I'd like that. Maybe we could arrange regular visits. I could set up a trust fund for her education, her future medical needs." "Stop," Bradford said. Vivian finally looked at him, confused. "Just stop planning how to manage us like we're a business problem," she flinched. "That's not what I'm doing. I'm trying to figure out how to keep you both in my life when the contract says you're supposed to leave." Bradford turned to face her fully, then tear up the contract. Her eyes widened. "What?" He took her hands, feeling them tremble. "Tear it up. Stay married to me not because some legal document says you have to, not because your grandmother's will requires it, but because you want to. Because this," he gestured between them, toward the house where Ruby slept. "This is real now. It stopped being fake somewhere around the time you learned to make macaroni and cheese." Vivian was crying, silent tears tracking down her face. "I'm terrible at this, at relationships, at being vulnerable, at all the things a wife and mother should be." Bradford smiled through his own tears. "You're terrible at pretending to be those things. You're pretty damn good at actually being them. Ruby loves you. I love you. Not the version of you that's perfect and put together, but the version who tries and messes up and keeps showing up anyway." She pulled him close, burying her face in his neck. "I love you," she said, muffled against his skin. "I've loved you since that first dinner when you told me I didn't have to be lonely. I was just too scared to admit it." They held each other under the stars, two broken people who'd accidentally made something whole. The next morning, Bradford woke to his phone ringing. Unknown number. He answered groggily, and a crisp voice informed him that he was speaking with Robert, Vivian's attorney. "I'm calling to inform you that there will be a final review of Mrs. Sterling's marriage next week," Robert said. "The Inheritance Committee requires one last verification before releasing control of the company. They'll be conducting interviews with both of you separately, investigating your living situation thoroughly. If they find any evidence that the marriage was contracted purely for inheritance purposes, Mrs. Sterling will forfeit all rights and potentially face legal consequences for fraud." Bradford's blood went cold. "Legal consequences?" Robert's voice softened slightly. "They're taking this seriously. There are whispers that someone tipped them off about the unusual nature of your marriage. They'll be looking for any crack in the facade." Bradford found Vivian in her office, already on the phone with Robert, her face pale. When she hung up, she looked at Bradford with something close to panic. "They know," she said, "or they suspect. Someone told them this wasn't real." Bradford's mind raced. "But it is real. Now, that has to count for something." Vivian shook her head. "It started as a contract. We signed papers. There's documentation. If they find that original agreement—" She didn't finish. They both knew what would happen. She'd lose the company her grandmother had built, the legacy that was supposed to be hers. She might face criminal charges, and worse, far worse, she'd lose them. The divorce would be immediate, mandated by the court. Ruby would go back to their old apartment, and Vivian would disappear behind her walls again. "Then we tell them the truth," Bradford said. Vivian looked at him like he'd suggested they burn the house down. "What truth?" "That I paid you $500,000 to marry me?" He crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "That you did, yes, but also that something happened we didn't expect. That somewhere between the contract and now, we fell in love. That Ruby found a mother, and you found a family, And I found someone who makes me want to believe in second chances. We tell them that started as business and became everything else." Vivian's throat worked. "They won't believe it. Why would they?" Bradford smiled sadly. "Because it's true. And because when you love someone, it shows. You can't fake the way you look at Ruby. You can't manufacture the way you hold my hand when you think no one's watching. The contract was fake. This isn't." The interview was scheduled for Friday. They had 3 days to prepare, though Bradford insisted there was nothing to prepare. "We just have to be ourselves," he kept saying, while Vivian paced and catastrophized and drafted talking points. Ruby, oblivious to the tension, bounced around the house excited about the important people who were coming to visit. On Thursday night, Vivian couldn't sleep. Bradford found her at 2 a.m. in the kitchen, surrounded by printed copies of the original contract. "I'm going to lose everything," she whispered. "The company, the house, you, Ruby." Bradford sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "You're not going to lose us. Even if the worst happens, even if they take the company and charge you and force us to divorce, you're not losing us. We'll figure it out." "How?" she asked, and she sounded young, frightened. "I won't have the money to keep the house." "You'll go back to your apartment. Ruby will—" Bradford cut her off with a kiss. "Ruby will have a mother who loves her, and a father who loves her, and we'll make it work because that's what families do. The house doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. You matter." Vivian clung to him. "I've never had anyone fight for me before. Everyone in my life has wanted something. My name, my company, my connections. You're the first person who just wanted me." Bradford held her tighter. "Then you've been surrounded by idiots because you're worth fighting for, even if we have to prove it to a room full of lawyers." Friday arrived too quickly. The inheritance committee sent 2 representatives, the sharp-eyed older woman from the gala and a younger man who looked like he missed nothing. They set up in Vivian's dining room. Notepads and recorders spread across the table. They interviewed Vivian first, asking detailed questions about how they'd met, when she'd fallen in love, what their daily life looked like. Bradford waited in the living room, Ruby playing quietly beside him, both of them trying not to listen through the door. An hour passed. When Vivian emerged, her face was composed, but her hands were shaking. The investigators called Bradford in next. They started with simple questions. Where had he lived before? What did he do for work? How had he met Vivian? Bradford told the truth. All of it. The hospital, the desperate phone call, how Vivian had approached him with a proposition that sounded insane. He saw them exchange glances, preparing for the kill. "So, Mrs. Sterling offered you money to marry her," the older woman said. $500,000. Bradford nodded. "She did." The woman leaned forward. "And you accepted this money in exchange for pretending to be her husband." Bradford met her gaze steadily. "No. I accepted the money to actually become her husband. There's a difference." The younger man frowned. "How is there a difference? You entered into a contractual arrangement for financial compensation." "Yes," Bradford agreed. "That's how it started. But that's not how it ended. Or how it is now. When I signed that contract, I thought I was agreeing to 3 months of acting. What I got instead was a family. Vivian isn't pretending to love my daughter. Ruby isn't pretending to love her back. And I'm not pretending that somewhere along the way, I fell completely in love with my wife." The older woman's expression didn't change. "How convenient that you fell in love with a billionaire." Bradford laughed, sharp and humorless. "You want to know what's convenient? Before Vivian, I was working 2 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night, terrified every time my daughter's heart skipped a beat. That was convenient. This," he gestured around the room, "this is terrifying. Because now I have something to lose. I have someone who depends on me being brave enough to be vulnerable. I have a daughter who calls Vivian Mom and means it. You think I wanted to complicate my life like this?" The younger man scribbled notes. "So you admit the marriage began as a financial transaction?" Bradford didn't blink. "Absolutely. And I admit that I've never been happier in my life. Both things are true. The question is whether you care more about how something started or where it ended up." The older woman studied him for a long moment. Mrs. Sterling indicated that she initiated this arrangement because she needed to fulfill her grandmother's will. "That suggests a mercenary motive." Bradford shook his head. "It suggests someone desperate enough to guarantee her inheritance that she'd marry a stranger. But you know what else it suggests? Someone so lonely she couldn't imagine anyone marrying her for any reason except money. She didn't think she was worth loving. I've spent 3 months proving her wrong." They asked him more questions about their routines, their arguments, intimate details, meant to catch inconsistencies. Bradford answered everything honestly. He told them about teaching Vivian to cook, about how she'd learned to braid Ruby's hair from YouTube videos, about the way she still worked too much, but now felt guilty about it. He told them about the night Ruby asked if they could be a family forever, and how Vivian had cried. He told them about falling asleep together on the couch and waking up to find she'd covered him with a blanket. Small things, domestic things, the building blocks of a real life. When he finished, the room was quiet. The older woman's expression had softened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Hayes," she said finally, "you understand that if we determine this marriage was fraudulent, your wife faces serious consequences." Bradford nodded. "I understand. But it's not fraudulent anymore. Maybe it was in the beginning. Maybe we both signed those papers for the wrong reasons. But people change. Feelings change." 3 months ago, Vivian Sterling was a stranger who offered me money. Today she's my wife, and I can't imagine my life without her. If that's fraud, then I guess love is fraud, because it never looks like what you expect. The younger man glanced at his colleague. They excused Bradford and called for Ruby. Bradford's heart clenched. "She's 6, he said. "She doesn't understand legal proceedings. This will scare her." The older woman's expression gentled. "We just want to ask her a few questions. We'll be kind." Ruby went in holding her favorite stuffed elephant, and Bradford stood outside the door, every instinct screaming at him to protect her from this. Through the door, he heard the murmur of voices, Ruby's higher pitch answering questions. It lasted only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When they opened the door, Ruby ran to him, and he scooped her up. The investigators called Vivian and Bradford together. They sat side by side at the dining table, hands clasped under the table where no one could see. The older woman shuffled her papers, her expression unreadable. "We've completed our investigation," she said. "We found evidence of the original contract between you. We also found evidence that substantial money changed hands." Vivian's grip on Bradford's hand tightened painfully. The woman continued. "We also found evidence of something else. A home filled with a child's artwork. A woman who knew her stepdaughter's favorite foods, her bedtime routine, the name of her stuffed elephant. A man who makes coffee without being asked and leaves notes on his wife's desk. We found text messages between you discussing grocery lists and doctor appointments, and whether to paint the guest room blue or green. We found photographs, hundreds of them, of a family in formation." She paused, looking between them. "Mrs. Sterling, your grandmother's will required that you be married before your 35th birthday. It did not require that you marry for love. But I knew your grandmother. I served on her board for 20 years, and I know what she actually wanted for you." The woman reached into her briefcase and pulled out an envelope. "She left this with me, to be delivered only if I determined your marriage was real." Vivian took the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter, handwritten in her grandmother's elegant script. Bradford watched Vivian's eyes move across the page, watched tears begin to fall. When she finished, she passed it to Bradford. The letter read, "My dearest Vivian, if you're reading this, it means you found someone. I don't care if you started with a contract or a chance meeting or a drunken mistake. I care that you found someone who sees past the armor you've worn since you were a little girl. Someone who makes you laugh, who challenges you, who stays. The company is yours. It was always going to be yours. The marriage requirement was just my way of forcing you to let someone in. You've spent your whole life alone because you thought that made you strong. Now learn that letting people love you is the real strength. Be happy, my darling. That's all I ever wanted for you." The older woman stood. "The Inheritance Committee finds that Mrs. Sterling's marriage is legitimate and fulfills all requirements of the will. The company transfers to your full control immediately. Congratulations." She packed her briefcase, nodded to them both, and left with her colleague. For a moment, Vivian and Bradford just sat there, stunned. Then Vivian turned to him, laughing and crying at the same time. "We did it," she said. "We fooled them." Bradford shook his head, pulling her close. "We didn't fool anyone. We just told them the truth." Ruby ran in then, throwing herself at both of them, and they collapsed into a tangle of arms and relief and joy. 6 months later, Bradford stood in front of a different altar, not a city hall office, but a small chapel filled with flowers and the few people who mattered. Margaret was there, dabbing at her eyes. Robert the attorney had even cracked a smile. Ruby stood beside them in a white dress, holding a basket of rose petals, practically vibrating with excitement. Vivian walked down the aisle alone, wearing a simple white dress, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers Ruby had helped pick. This time, there was no contract. There were no terms and conditions, no expiration date, no escape clause. There was just a man and a woman who'd found each other in the strangest way possible and decided to do it again, properly. When the officiant asked if they took each other to be lawfully wedded spouses, they both said yes, with voices that didn't shake. When he said Bradford could kiss his bride, Bradford pulled Vivian close and kissed her the way he'd wanted to since that first stiff peck at City Hall, thoroughly, deeply, like she was everything he'd been missing. Ruby cheered. The small gathering applauded. Vivian laughed against his mouth. And Bradford thought about contract and choice, about love you buy and love you build, about all the ways you can stumble into happiness when you're not looking for it. They moved out of the mansion, not immediately, but gradually. Vivian wanted something smaller, something that felt like theirs rather than an inheritance. They found a house in a neighborhood with good schools and front porches, the kind of place where kids played in yards and neighbors knew each other's names. Bradford designed the renovation himself, his first major project since becoming a father. Vivian cut her hours at the company, delegating more, trusting her team. She learned that the world didn't collapse when she wasn't personally controlling every detail. Ruby thrived, her heart strong, her laugh constant. She'd started introducing Vivian as my mom, dropping the step without fanfare, and Vivian never corrected her. One evening, almost a year after that first hospital meeting, Bradford found Vivian in their new kitchen, smaller than the mansion's, more worn, infinitely better, making macaroni and cheese from scratch. She didn't burn it anymore. Ruby was at the table doing homework, occasionally asking questions that Vivian answered with increasing confidence. The radio played something jazzy. The windows were open to let in spring air. Bradford leaned against the doorframe, watching this scene of perfect ordinary domesticity, and Vivian looked up, catching his eye. "What?" she asked, smiling. He shook his head. "Just thinking about that contract. 3 months, $500,000, a clean divorce at the end." Vivian laughed, stirring the pot. "Best money I ever spent." Ruby looked up from her homework. "Daddy, Vivi, can we get a dog?" They exchanged glances, that silent communication couples develop. Maybe, Vivian said. A small one, Bradford added. Ruby pumped her fist in victory and returned to her math problems. Bradford crossed to Vivian, wrapped his arms around her from behind, rested his chin on her shoulder. You know what's funny, he murmured. What? I thought you were hiring a husband, but really, you were just looking for a home. Vivian turned in his arms, kissed him softly. I wasn't looking for anything. That was the problem. I'd stopped believing I could have this. And now? Bradford asked. She glanced around their kitchen, at the finger paintings on the refrigerator, at Ruby's backpack spilling across the floor, at the mess and noise and beautiful chaos of a life being lived. Now I can't remember what I was so afraid of. She kissed him again. Ruby made a gagging sound. Gross. You guys kiss all the time. They broke apart, laughing. Get used to it, kid, Bradford said. We've got like 70 more years of this planned. Vivian's hand found his, their rings clicking together. No longer symbols of a transaction, but promises they'd chosen to keep. That night, after Ruby was asleep and the dishes were done, they sat on their back porch under the stars. Not the manicured patio of the mansion, but a simple wooden deck Bradford had built himself. Do you ever wonder, Vivian said quietly, what would have happened if I hadn't gone to that hospital that night? Bradford considered. You would have found someone else, signed a contract with them. Gotten your inheritance. Vivian shook her head. I would have gotten the company. I don't think I would have gotten this. She gestured between them, at the house behind them, at the life they'd built. This required you, your daughter, your patience, your complete inability to let me hide behind my walls. Bradford pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, fitting perfectly against him, like she'd been designed for that exact space. You want to know a secret? He said. I knew. Knew what? That night at the hospital, when you approached me with your insane proposition. I knew it wasn't just about the money. I knew you needed saving as much as I needed that surgery money for Ruby. Vivian lifted her head to look at him. You couldn't have known that. We'd never met. Bradford smiled. I could see it in your eyes. You had everything and nothing at the same time. All that money, all that power. And you were the loneliest person I'd ever seen. You offered me $500,000, but what you were really asking was, please pretend to love me for 3 months so I can remember what that feels like. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. And you said yes. I said yes, Bradford confirmed. Best decision I ever made. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the neighborhood settle into night. Dogs barking, cars pulling into driveways, the distant sound of someone's television. Ordinary sounds, beautiful sounds, the sounds of belonging. Bradford? Vivian said after a while. Yeah? Thank you for being brave enough to let me be broken, for not running when you saw how much work I'd need. For teaching me that love isn't a transaction or a performance. It's just showing up. Every day, even when it's hard. Bradford kissed the top of her head. Thank you for paying me $500,000 to marry you. Best investment you ever made. She laughed, that full, genuine laugh he'd worked so hard to earn. You're never going to let me forget that, are you? Not a chance, he said. I'm going to tell that story at Ruby's wedding, at our 50th anniversary, at your retirement party. Did you know my wife literally had to buy a husband because Vivian cut him off with a kiss? Because she was an idiot who didn't know what love looked like until it moved into her house and taught her how to make pasta. They went inside eventually, to the home they'd chosen together, the life they'd built from the strangest beginning. Ruby was sprawled across her bed, one arm thrown over her stuffed elephant, peaceful and healthy and loved. Vivian stood in the doorway watching her, and Bradford stood behind Vivian, watching them both. 3 people who shouldn't have been a family, who'd started as a transaction and become everything else. "She's perfect," Vivian whispered. "She's ours," Bradford corrected. "That's what makes her perfect." They closed Ruby's door softly and went to their own room, the one with photos of all 3 of them covering the walls, proof that they'd existed together, that this was real. As Bradford drifted off to sleep, Vivian curled against him, her breathing evening out. He thought about contracts and choice, about how sometimes the best things in life start for the wrong reasons and become right anyway. About how you can buy someone's time but never their heart, unless you're willing to give yours in return. About how 3 months can feel like forever when you're pretending, but forever doesn't feel long enough when it's real. The contract had been torn up months ago, ceremonially burned in their fireplace while Ruby cheered. But the marriage remained, not because a piece of paper said so, but because they woke up every morning and chose it. Chose each other. Chose this beautiful, complicated, messy reality they'd built from what was supposed to be fake. And in the end, that choice, that daily decision to stay, to try, to love, was worth infinitely more than $500,000. It was worth everything.